I always thought envy was a small thing. A whisper in the back of my mind, a passing thought that lingered for just a moment before moving on. Everyone felt it, right? I never saw it as something to worry about. It wasn't like I was out there plotting to ruin someone else's life or trying to sabotage anyone. No, my envy was quieter, more subtle. It showed up when I saw someone get a promotion at work, someone who hadn't been there as long as I had. It crept in when I scrolled through social media, watching friends vacation in places I'd only dreamt of, or when I'd see a neighbor with a new car that gleamed under the sun while mine rattled and wheezed. I didn't even recognize it as envy at first. It felt more like a dull, constant ache, a sense that everyone else was moving forward while I was stuck, treading water. I thought I was just being realistic, acknowledging that life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned. I would smile and congratulate others, but inside I was stewing, comparing my achievements with theirs, wondering what they had that I didn't. It wasn't until much later that I realized how deeply that feeling had sunk its roots into my life, how it had slowly been draining the joy out of everything I did. There were days when I would sit at my desk at work, pretending to focus on whatever was in front of me, but my mind would be elsewhere. I'd be replaying conversations I'd had, thinking about colleagues who had somehow found their way up the ladder faster than I had. How did they manage it? What did they know that I didn't? I'd see them breeze past my office, smiling and confident, and I'd feel this bitter, heavy feeling settle in my chest. I'd force myself to smile back, but the smile never reached my eyes. I think, deep down, I was afraid to admit to myself just how much it bothered me. It wasn't just at work, either. I noticed it creeping into other parts of my life. When friends talked about their relationships, I'd nod along, but all I could think about was how lonely I felt. They seemed to have it all figured out, the perfect partner, the happy home life, the kind of love that made them glow. I told myself I was happy for them, and maybe I was in some small way, but there was always that other part of me that whispered, why not me? I didn't want to feel that way. I knew it was wrong, that it was a kind of poison, but I didn't know how to stop it. Looking back, I can see how envy became such a constant presence, an undercurrent to everything I did. It was like living with a slow, simmering frustration, this sense that the world had passed me by and I was just a spectator, watching everyone else get ahead. It wasn't enough to ruin my life, not outright, but it was there, always there, eating away at me in small, almost imperceptible ways. I didn't talk about it with anyone, of course. How could I? I couldn't exactly go around telling people that I resented them for their success or their happiness. That would make me sound petty, bitter, and small, everything I didn't want to be. But then everything changed one cold November afternoon. I remember the day clearly, though sometimes I wish I didn't. I was leaving the office late, like usual, my head buzzing with thoughts about another missed opportunity. There had been a job opening, a promotion that I had set my sights on, but once again, it had gone to someone else. A younger colleague, someone who, in my mind, didn't deserve it as much as I did. I kept replaying the moment I found out, the casual way my boss had mentioned it, as if it didn't matter at all. But it did matter. It mattered to me. I didn't even know how I got to my car. I just remember being in the parking lot, the chill biting through my coat, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. I must have been so caught up in my thoughts that I didn't even see it coming. The pain hit me out of nowhere, sharp and sudden, like a vice tightening around my chest. I remember gasping, struggling to breathe, my vision blurring as I staggered, clutching at my chest. It felt like the world was caving in around me, like I was being crushed under a weight I couldn't lift. I managed to stumble to the side of the car, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath, but it was no use. The pain was relentless, a searing, burning sensation that spread through my chest and down my arm. For a moment, I thought I was dying, and then I realized that I probably was. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, my legs gave out, and I crumpled to the ground. The cold, hard pavement pressed against my cheek, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I tried to cry out, but the sound was weak, barely a whisper. It was as if my body was shutting down, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I remember thinking that this was it, that this was how it all ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, alone in a dark parking lot, surrounded by the empty silence of a world that didn't even know I was leaving it. But as the darkness closed in around me, something strange happened. I felt this sensation, a pulling, as if I was being dragged out of my own body. It was disorienting, like being pulled underwater, but there was no panic, no struggle. Just a slow, gentle pull that I couldn't resist. The pain was still there, but it was distant now, like an echo fading into the background. I remember feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I was watching myself from a distance. I could see my body lying there on the pavement, still and lifeless, but it didn't feel real. It was like looking at a photograph, something static and far away. And then there was nothing. Just darkness. Complete and utter blackness, stretching out in all directions, endless and infinite. I didn't know where I was or what was happening, but I felt like I was floating, suspended in that darkness. There was no sound, no light, just this overwhelming, suffocating emptiness. I tried to move, to find something solid to hold onto, but there was nothing. It felt like I was drifting, lost in a vast, endless ocean of black, with no sense of direction or purpose. I don't know how long I was there. It could have been seconds, or it could have been an eternity. Time didn't seem to exist in that place. But then, slowly, I began to notice something. A faint light, barely visible at first, like a tiny pinprick in the distance. I couldn't tell if it was getting closer or if I was moving toward it, but the longer I stared, the brighter it became. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen. It was warm and soft, not harsh or blinding, and as it grew, I felt this strange, inexplicable pull toward it. For a moment, I thought it might be the end, that I was finally going to cross over, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made me hesitate. The light was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but it was also unnerving, like a siren's call. I wanted to go to it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting for me on the other side, something I wasn't ready to face. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to shift, to change, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that seeped into my bones. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. The realization that I wasn't alone was like ice water running through my veins. I couldn't see anything, but I could sense it, a presence or maybe several, lurking somewhere in the darkness. The light that had been so inviting just moments ago was now gone, swallowed up by the blackness, leaving me suspended in an oppressive void. It was hard to explain, but I felt eyes on me, as if something was watching, waiting. I wanted to turn around, to see if there was something behind me, but it was like I was paralyzed, unable to move or even blink. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to see shapes emerging from the dark, faint outlines shifting and flickering at the edge of my vision. They were indistinct at first, barely more than shadows, but as they drew closer, they took on more defined forms. They were human-like, but wrong, twisted in ways that made my stomach twist with unease. Some of them were hunched over, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they weren't used to having bodies. Others slithered, almost gliding over the unseen ground, and their faces. I couldn't make out details, but I could feel their expressions, twisted into cruel, mocking smiles. I felt a pressure build in my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe, as if the air was being sucked out of my lungs. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing fit. This wasn't a dream. It was too vivid, too real, and yet it defied everything I knew. I wanted to scream, to force myself awake, but the darkness seemed to swallow even the thought of sound. All I could do was watch as the shapes came closer, surrounding me, their faces contorted with a kind of sadistic glee. And then I heard it, a low guttural whisper, like nails scraping over stone. It was barely a sound at all, more like a vibration that resonated deep inside my skull. I couldn't make out the words at first, just a harsh, grating noise that sent chills down my spine. But as it repeated, over and over, the words began to form, slipping through the darkness like poison. You don't belong here. You never did. I wanted to deny it, to shout back that it wasn't true, but I couldn't find my voice. The words echoed in my head, louder and louder, until they were all I could hear. And then, as if on cue, the figures moved, closing in on me. Their faces twisted into leering grins, and I could see their eyes now, dark and empty, like black pits that seemed to absorb all the light around them. One of them stepped forward, towering over me, and I could feel its gaze boring into me, stripping me bare. There was something in those eyes, something that saw straight through me, past every mask I had ever worn, every lie I had ever told myself. It was like being dissected, every flaw, every sin laid out for all to see. The pressure in my chest grew worse, and I realized I was shaking, not just from fear, but from a deep, overwhelming sense of shame. The creature leaned in closer, its face mere inches from mine, and I could see the edges of its mouth curling into a grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It spoke again, its voice dripping with contempt, each word a dagger that cut deeper than the last. You think you're better than them, don't you? But you're not. You've spent your life coveting what others have, never satisfied, never content. Always wanting more, always resenting them for having what you don't. The accusations hit me like a physical blow, each one driving the breath from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to tell it that it was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. Because deep down, I knew it was right. I had always felt that way, even if I never said it out loud. I had spent so much time envying others, comparing myself to them, measuring my worth against their success, that I had forgotten how to see the good in my own life. The creature circled me, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring my discomfort. "You hit it well," it continued, its tone almost mocking. "A smile here, a polite word there. But inside, you were rotting, weren't you? Eating yourself alive, little by little." I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't want to give it the satisfaction of seeing me break. I clenched my fists, trying to hold on to some semblance of control, but it was slipping through my fingers like sand. The creature's grin widened, as if it could sense my struggle, and it reached out, its long bony fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was cold, freezing, and it sent a jolt of pain through my entire body. "You thought no one noticed," it said, its voice barely more than a whisper now, almost gentle. "But we did. We've always been watching. Waiting." I didn't understand what it meant, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. How could they have been watching? Who were they? I had so many questions, but no way to ask them. The creature seemed to sense my confusion, and it laughed, a low rumbling sound that echoed through the darkness. "You don't understand, do you?" it said, its eyes gleaming with amusement. "You thought this was all there was. That your little life, your little struggles, were the only things that mattered. But there's so much more, so much you can't see. And you with your petty envy, your endless comparisons. You were blind to it all." The word stung, and I felt a hot burning shame rise up inside me, mixing with the fear and confusion. I wanted to argue, to tell it that it was wrong, that I wasn't like that, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew that I was. I had spent so much of my life focusing on what I didn't have, on what I thought I deserved, that I had missed everything else. As if sensing my realization, the creature's expression softened, almost pitying. "You think you're the only one who feels this way?" it asked, its voice quieter now, almost sad. "You're not. You're just one of many, lost and drifting, never satisfied, never content. Always wanting, always reaching, but never finding." It was as if the words were being pulled out of me, dredged up from the deepest, darkest parts of my mind. I wanted to scream, to tell it to stop, but the words just kept coming, spilling out uncontrollably. And as they did, the darkness around me seemed to shift, to pulse, as if it was reacting to my thoughts, feeding off of them. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a new voice emerged. This one was different, deeper, colder, and filled with a kind of malice that made the others seem almost tame. It was a voice that commanded attention, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The shadows around me parted, and I saw it, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, a towering figure cloaked in darkness. It was different from the others, larger, more imposing, and there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the way it looked, though that was terrifying enough. It was the way it moved, the way it seemed to glide effortlessly through the darkness, as if it belonged there, as if it was part of the shadows themselves. When it spoke, the words were slow and deliberate, each one dripping with disdain. "You think you can hide from your own soul?" it asked, its voice echoing through the void. "You think you can escape the truth?" The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could see its face more clearly, or rather the absence of a face. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless mask of darkness that seemed to shift and change with the light. But despite the lack of features, I could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, as if it was looking straight through me, seeing everything I had ever tried to hide. "You have spent your life coveting what others had, never content, never grateful. You thought it was harmless, but it was a poison, one that you fed every day. And now, it has consumed you." The words were like a slap to the face, harsh and unforgiving. I wanted to protest, to tell it that it wasn't true, but the words died in my throat. Because deep down, I knew that it was. I had spent so much time comparing myself to others, resenting their success, their happiness, that I had lost sight of everything else. And now, standing there in the darkness, surrounded by these figures, I realized just how much it had cost me. The towering figure leaned in closer, its presence suffocating, and for a moment, I thought it was going to crush me, to squeeze the life out of me. But instead, it spoke again, its voice softer now, almost a whisper. You wanted more, always more, but you never saw what you already had. And now, you have nothing. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my knees buckle, the strength draining out of my legs. I wanted to fall, to collapse into the darkness and disappear, but something kept me standing, kept me rooted in place. The figure's eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, seemed to bore into me, holding me there, forcing me to confront the truth. You think this is the end? It asked, its voice low and mocking. No. This is just the beginning. There is so much more for you to see, so much more for you to understand. And you will, in time. But first, you must face the truth of who you are. As the figure spoke, I felt a chill spread through my body, a cold creeping dread that seemed to seep into my bones. It was as if the darkness was closing in around me, suffocating me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were frozen, my voice trapped in my throat. And all the while, the figure just watched, silent and unmoving, its presence a constant, suffocating weight. For a moment, I thought I was going to be swallowed up by the darkness, lost forever in that cold, empty void. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back, and the shadows around me seemed to shift, to retreat. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt a strange, inexplicable sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off my chest. And then, through the darkness, I saw it, a faint, flickering light, barely visible, but growing stronger with each passing second. It was different from the light I had seen before, softer, warmer, and as it drew closer, I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a feeling I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. But I knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far more terrifying. As the flickering light grew closer, the darkness around me seemed to recoil, pulling back as if it couldn't bear to be near it. I felt a warmth spreading through me, gentle and soothing, unlike the cold, oppressive presence that had surrounded me moments before. The shadows that had seemed so menacing began to fade, dissolving into the distance, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe again. The light was soft and pale, not blinding, but comforting, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long dark night. As it approached, I could make out a figure within it, moving gracefully, almost gliding. At first, I couldn't see the details, just a silhouette framed by the warm glow, but as it drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one. Tall, with an ethereal presence, they radiated a sense of peace that I couldn't quite understand. When the figure finally stepped out of the light, I could see them more clearly. They wore a simple flowing robe that shimmered in the light, and their face was serene, with eyes that seemed to hold a depth of kindness I had never seen before. There was no judgment there, no contempt, just a calm, gentle understanding that made me want to look away, as if I didn't deserve to be seen by those eyes. For a long moment, we just stood there, facing each other in the silence. I didn't know what to say, or if I could even speak. I felt small, exposed, as if everything I had ever tried to hide was laid bare in front of this being. The warmth I felt was soothing, but it also made me painfully aware of how cold and empty I had been, how deeply the shadows had crept into my soul. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they simply smiled, a soft, sad smile that seemed to convey 1,000 emotions at once. "I am here to show you what you have forgotten," they said, their voice calm and gentle, yet carrying a weight that made it clear this was not a question of choice. "To remind you of the light you have always carried within you, even when you could not see it." I wanted to protest, to tell them that they were wrong, that there was no light in me, not anymore. But the words wouldn't come. The figure stepped closer, and as they did, I felt that warmth again, stronger this time, as if it was flowing through me, pushing back against the cold that had gripped my heart. "You've been lost for so long," they continued, their voice barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the space around us, reverberating in the darkness. "Chasing shadows, chasing things that could never fill the emptiness inside you. You thought you were alone, that no one saw your pain, but that was never true. You were never alone." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I struggled to swallow it down. "But I said, my voice breaking. "I am. No one understands. No one sees me." The figure shook their head slowly, and there was a tenderness in their eyes that made my chest ache. "You have been seen, even when you did not wish to be. You have been loved, even when you could not love yourself. But you could not see it because you were too busy looking at what others had, at what you thought was missing from your own life. I wanted to deny it, to tell them they didn't understand, but as I looked into their eyes, I felt something shift inside me. It was as if a door I had kept locked for so long had been opened, and all the emotions I had tried to suppress, all the envy, the bitterness, the longing came rushing out. I didn't want to feel it, but I couldn't stop it. It was like a dam had burst, and there was nothing I could do to hold back the flood. Tears stung my eyes, and I felt my knees weaken, as if the weight of everything was finally too much to bear. I sank to the ground, my hands trembling, and I couldn't stop the sobs that tore from my throat. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I just wanted to be happy." The figure knelt down beside me, and I felt their hand on my shoulder, warm and reassuring. "I know," they said softly, "but happiness does not come from taking what others have. It does not come from comparing yourself to others, from measuring your worth against theirs. Happiness comes from within, from accepting yourself as you are, and from seeing the beauty in the life you have, not the life you think you should have." I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall freely, and for the first time, I didn't try to fight them. I had spent so long trying to pretend that everything was fine, that I was fine, but now in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I was tired of pretending, tired of fighting against the feelings that had been eating away at me for so long. "I don't know how to do that," I confessed, my voice shaking. "I don't know how to be happy with what I have. It always feels like there's something missing, like I'm not enough." The figure's hand moved from my shoulder to my chin, gently lifting my head so that I was looking into their eyes again. "That is because you have been looking outside yourself for what can only be found within," they said. "You are enough, just as you are. But you must learn to see yourself through the eyes of love, not envy." I didn't understand what they meant, not fully, but there was something in their words that resonated with me, something that made me want to believe. For so long, I had been chasing after things, after achievements, thinking that if I could just reach the next goal, then I would finally feel satisfied. But it had never worked. No matter how much I accomplished, there was always something more, something just out of reach, and the more I chased, the more distant it seemed to become. The figure seemed to sense my thoughts, and they smiled again, a sad, knowing smile. "You have been running in circles, chasing a mirage," they said. "But you don't need to chase it anymore. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone. You are already worthy, just by being. That is the truth you have forgotten, and that is the truth you must remember." For a moment, I just sat there, letting their words sink in. It felt like a foreign concept, something I had never allowed myself to consider. Could it really be that simple? Could it really be true that I was enough, just as I was? I wanted to believe it, but there was a part of me that resisted, that clung to the familiar pain, the familiar doubts. But how? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. How do I change? How do I stop feeling this way? The figure's eyes softened, and they reached out, taking my hand in theirs. "It is not about changing who you are," they said. "It is about seeing who you truly are. You are not defined by your envy, by your fears, or by your shortcomings. Those are just shadows, illusions that have clouded your vision. The light you seek is already within you, waiting to be seen." As they spoke, I felt a warmth spreading through my hand, flowing from their touch into my chest, and for a brief, beautiful moment, the cold, heavy feeling that had been with me for so long began to melt away. It was as if a light had been lit inside me, small but bright, pushing back against the darkness. "You don't have to be perfect," the figure continued, their voice steady and calm. "You don't have to have everything figured out. It's okay to feel lost, to struggle. But don't let those struggles define you. Let them be a part of your journey, not the end of it. And remember, even in your darkest moments, you are never truly alone." As the warmth spread through me, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years, a peace I didn't even realize I had been missing. It was a strange sensation, like coming home after a long, exhausting journey, and finding everything exactly as it should be. I didn't know how long it would last, or if I could hold on to it, but in that moment, it was enough. The figure slowly rose, and I felt their hands slip from mine, but the warmth they had given me remained, a small, steady flame inside my chest. "This is not the end," they said, their voice gentle but firm. "It is a new beginning. You have a chance to change, to let go of the envy that has held you back, and to find the light within yourself. It will not be easy, but it will be worth it. And you will not be alone." I looked up at them, a million questions still swirling in my mind, but before I could speak, the light around them began to grow brighter, filling the space until I could no longer see them. Wait. I called out, my heart pounding. Don't go. But their voice echoed through the light, soft and reassuring. I am not going anywhere. I am always with you. You just need to remember. And with that, the light flared blinding and brilliant, and I felt myself being pulled back, as if the world was spinning around me. The warmth, the peace, the figure, everything was fading, slipping away, but I clung to their words, to the small flickering light inside me that had been ignited. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on to. As the light faded, and the darkness began to close in again, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet, fragile hope that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Because I knew deep down that the light was still there inside me, and that as long as I held on to it, I would find my way. The first thing I felt when I woke up was the cold, sterile air of the hospital room. It hit me all at once, a stark contrast to the warmth I had felt in that strange, impossible place. The bright fluorescent lights above me were harsh, almost painful, and I squinted, trying to make sense of where I was. It took a moment for my vision to clear, for the buzzing in my head to fade, and then I saw the familiar beeping of a heart monitor, the steady rhythm filling the silence. I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had come back. The realization hit me slowly, as if my mind was still trying to catch up to my body. I had been so sure that I was gone, that I had crossed some line from which there was no return, but here I was, breathing, blinking, my heart still beating in my chest. It felt surreal, like waking up from a dream that was too vivid to be real, but too real to be just a dream. I turned my head slightly, wincing at the stiffness in my neck, and saw a nurse standing by the door, her eyes wide with surprise. She had been checking something on a clipboard, but when she saw me, she nearly dropped it, rushing over to my side. "You're awake," she said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. "I'll get the doctor. Just stay calm, okay?" I wanted to ask her what had happened, how long I had been here, but my throat felt dry and raw, and all that came out was a hoarse croak. Before I could try again, she was gone, leaving me alone in the room with the steady beeping of the machines. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but all I could think about was what I had seen, what I had felt. The darkness, the light, the figure that had spoken to me. It was all still there, lingering at the edge of my mind, like a half-remembered dream. When the doctor arrived, he was calm and composed, but I could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw me awake. He asked me a series of questions, the usual things. My name, the date, if I knew where I was, and I answered as best as I could, even though my mind felt sluggish, like it was wading through thick fog. He told me I had suffered a cardiac event, that they had found me collapsed in a parking lot and had brought me here. I listened, nodding, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that other place, to the strange encounter that felt more real than anything in this room. "You were very lucky," the doctor said, his tone carefully neutral, but I could hear the undertone of curiosity. "Most people in your condition, well, it's rare to see them make such a quick recovery." I wanted to tell him that it hadn't been luck, that there was more to it than he could possibly understand, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something that I barely understood myself? I could hardly wrap my mind around it, let alone put it into words that made sense. So I just nodded, letting him do most of the talking, while my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Over the next few days, as I recovered, I tried to tell myself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of the brain brought on by oxygen deprivation, or maybe a dream conjured by the medication they had given me. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real, that I had seen something, or someone, that was beyond anything I could explain. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the figure's face, hear their gentle, compassionate voice, and feel the warmth that had spread through me. It was like a light that had been lit inside me, small but steady, and it refused to go out. When I was finally discharged, I thought that maybe things would go back to normal, that I would step out of the hospital and return to my life, and everything would fall back into place. But it didn't. The world felt different, as if something fundamental had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it. Colors seemed brighter, sounds sharper, and every small detail seemed to demand my attention, like the world was trying to show me something I had been missing. But there was also a heaviness, a sense of disconnection, as if I was seeing everything through a pane of glass, separate and distant. The first time I tried to talk about it was with my sister. She had come to pick me up from the hospital, her face pale and drawn with worry, but when she saw me, she managed a smile, the kind of forced, brittle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I could tell she was trying to be strong for my sake, but I could also see the relief, the way she kept glancing at me, as if to reassure herself that I was really there. On the drive home, she asked me how I was feeling, and I told her I was fine, even though I knew it wasn't true. I could see her watching me out of the corner of her eye, as if she could sense that there was something I wasn't saying. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, I took a deep breath and tried to explain. "I saw something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "When I was out. It wasn't just darkness. There was something there. Someone." She glanced at me, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean? Like a dream?" I shook my head, struggling to find the right words. "No, it wasn't a dream. It was. I don't know how to describe it. It felt real. More real than anything I've ever experienced. There was this presence, and it spoke to me. It told me things about myself, about my life." I trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Part of me was afraid she would laugh, or worse, look at me with pity, like I was delusional. But when I glanced at her, I saw that she was just staring at me, her expression unreadable. "What did it say?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the figure's words, the way they had seen straight through me, stripped away all my defenses and laid my soul bare. It said that I was lost. That I had been chasing the wrong things. That I was hurting myself, and I didn't even realize it. There was a long silence, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Maybe it was just your brain trying to make sense of what was happening. You know, like when people have those near-death experiences, and they see a light, or something comforting." I knew she was trying to be supportive, trying to offer a rational explanation, but her words felt hollow, like they were missing the point. "It wasn't like that," I said, shaking my head. "It wasn't comforting. Not at first. It showed me things I didn't want to see. It made me face parts of myself that I'd been trying to ignore." She didn't say anything for a while, just kept her eyes on the road, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "I'm glad you're okay," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "But maybe it's best not to dwell on it too much. Just focus on getting better, okay?" I could tell she didn't understand, and I didn't blame her. How could she? I barely understood it myself. But the thought of just moving on, of pretending that nothing had happened, felt wrong. It felt like I would be denying something important, something that had changed me in a way I couldn't yet fully comprehend. Over the next few weeks, I tried to return to my routine, but everything felt off. I would go to work, sit at my desk, and try to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting, replaying the experience over and over. I found myself avoiding people, not because I didn't want to talk to them, but because I didn't know how. How was I supposed to explain what had happened to me? How was I supposed to tell them that I had seen something, felt something, that had shaken me to my core? I did try once, with a friend from work. We were having lunch, and the conversation had drifted to a colleague who had recently gotten a promotion. Normally, I would have felt that familiar twinge of envy, that bitter resentment that always seemed to flare up whenever someone else got ahead. But this time, it was different. I felt nothing. Or maybe not nothing, but a kind of distance, as if the emotions that had once consumed me were no longer there, at least not in the same way. My friend noticed the change, and she commented on it, joking that I must be mellowing out in my old age. I laughed, but then without really thinking, I told her about what had happened. About the darkness, the figure, the things it had said to me. I kept my voice light, trying to make it sound less serious than it was, but I could see the confusion, the concern in her eyes. "That sounds intense," she said, her tone cautious. "Are you sure it wasn't just, a really vivid dream? I mean, you were in a pretty bad state." I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, maybe. Who knows? Just thought it was interesting." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't really know how to respond, and after that, the conversation shifted to safer, more mundane topics. But I could feel the distance between us, the unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. It was like a wall had been erected between me and the rest of the world, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a way around it. I started to realize that maybe this wasn't something I could just talk about, at least not with most people. It was too strange, too personal, and every time I tried to explain it, the words felt inadequate, as if they could never capture the truth of what I had experienced. And yet, I couldn't let it go. The encounter had left a mark on me, a mark that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I spent a lot of time alone, thinking, trying to piece together what it all meant. The figure's words kept echoing in my head, over and over, and I kept coming back to that moment when they had told me I wasn't alone, that I was seen, even when I couldn't see myself. It was a comforting thought, but it was also a challenge, a reminder that I had to confront the parts of myself that I had been running from for so long. I knew deep down that I couldn't go back to the way things were. That I had to change, even if I didn't know how. And that realization was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, I felt like I had been given a second chance, a chance to live differently, to let go of the envy and the bitterness that had held me back. But I also knew that it wouldn't be easy, that it would be a struggle, and that there were no guarantees. As the days passed, I began to notice small changes in myself, subtle shifts in the way I saw the world. I found myself appreciating things I had once taken for granted, the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of laughter, the simple pleasure of a quiet moment. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small step toward something better. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment when everything clicked into place and I suddenly understood what I needed to do, who I needed to be. Instead, it was a gradual, sometimes painful process, like peeling back layers of old, scarred skin to reveal something raw and vulnerable underneath. The days turned into weeks and then months, and all the while, I felt like I was caught between two worlds. The world I had known before, where envy and dissatisfaction were my constant companions, and this new, unfamiliar place where I was trying to learn how to live differently, to see things with clearer eyes. I struggled. There were days when the old feelings would rise up, sharp and bitter, reminding me how easy it was to fall back into those old patterns of thinking. I would catch myself slipping, comparing my life to others, feeling that familiar sting of inadequacy, and it would take everything in me to stop, to remind myself that I was enough, that I didn't have to measure my worth by what others had. It was exhausting sometimes, fighting those instincts, but I knew I couldn't give up. I didn't want to go back to that dark, suffocating place I had been before, to the person who was always chasing something just out of reach. Slowly, I began to find new ways to fill the empty spaces that envy had left behind. I started volunteering at a community center, helping out with a local food drive. At first, it was just something to occupy my time, a way to distract myself from the chaos in my head. But as I spent more time there, I realized that it was more than that. It was a chance to connect with people, to see the struggles and triumphs of others, and to be a part of something bigger than myself. I met people whose lives were so different from mine, people who had faced hardships I could barely imagine, and yet they were still there, still fighting, still finding reasons to smile. It was humbling, in a way that made me see my own problems in a new light. I realized how much of my envy had been born from a narrow, self-centered perspective, how I had spent so much time looking at what I didn't have that I had forgotten to appreciate what I did. Being around people who had so little, yet found ways to be grateful for the small things, helped me see the world differently. It wasn't about pretending my struggles didn't matter, but about understanding that they weren't the only thing that mattered. There was one moment that stood out, a small, seemingly insignificant event that ended up meaning more to me than I could have imagined. I was helping an older man carry a box of canned goods to his car. He moved slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and as we walked, he told me about his life, about how he had lost his wife a few years ago, how he lived alone now, and how he sometimes felt like he was invisible, like the world had forgotten about him. There was a sadness in his voice, but there was also a kind of quiet strength, a resilience that I couldn't quite understand. When we reached his car, he turned to me and said, "Thank you for helping me today. You don't know how much it means, just to have someone see me, to know that I'm not alone." I didn't know what to say. It was such a simple thing, carrying a box, but to him, it had meant the world. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of warmth, a sense of connection that I hadn't felt in a long time. It reminded me of what the figure had told me, that I was never alone, even when I felt like I was. And I realized that maybe that was true for everyone, that we all carried our own struggles, our own fears, and that sometimes all it took was a small act of kindness to remind someone that they mattered, that they were seen. That moment changed something in me. I started looking for more ways to help, to reach out to others. Not because I thought I could save anyone or fix their problems, but because it made me feel alive, like I was a part of something real, something meaningful. I began to understand that the light I had been searching for wasn't something I could find by chasing after success or status. It was something I had to create, moment by moment, in the way I treated others, in the way I chose to live. I also had to face the difficult task of repairing relationships that my old behavior had strained. There were people I had pushed away, friends I had neglected because I was too caught up in my own misery to see their worth. I reached out to them, apologized for the distance I had created, and tried to make amends. Some were willing to reconnect, to start over, and those conversations, though awkward and painful at times, felt like a step toward healing. Others were less receptive, and I had to accept that some bridges had been burned too deeply to rebuild. It hurt, but it was a pain I could live with, because at least I was trying to be better, to own up to my mistakes. One of the hardest conversations I had was with my sister. After that first awkward attempt to explain what had happened to me, I hadn't brought it up again, and neither had she. But I could tell it was still there, lingering between us, a question unasked. One evening, after dinner, I found the courage to bring it up again. I told her everything, not just about the experience itself, but about how it had changed me, how I was trying to live differently, to let go of the envy that had held me back for so long. She listened quietly, and when I finished, there was a long silence. I braced myself for the worst, for her to tell me that she didn't understand, that she thought I was being ridiculous. But instead, she just sighed and said, "I'm glad you're trying to change. I was worried about you for a long time, but I didn't know how to help. I didn't know if you even wanted to be helped." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had always thought of my envy as a private struggle, something I kept hidden from the world, but she had seen it, had seen how it was affecting me, and she had been worried, even if she hadn't known how to say it. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting you too." She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "Whatever it is you're going through, we'll figure it out together." That moment, that simple act of kindness, felt like a promise, a lifeline that I hadn't even realized I needed. It was a reminder that change wasn't something I had to do by myself, that there were people who cared, who wanted to see me succeed, even when I doubted myself. As the months passed, I started to find a new sense of balance, a new way of being in the world. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when the old feelings would creep back, when I would catch myself falling into old patterns of thought, but they didn't have the same hold on me that they used to. I could recognize them for what they were, shadows from a past that I was slowly learning to leave behind. And each time I chose not to give in, not to let them dictate my actions, it felt like a small victory, a step toward becoming the person I wanted to be. I decided to take things further. I reached out to a local support group that focused on mindfulness and emotional healing, and I began attending their meetings. It was strange at first, sitting in a circle with strangers and talking about feelings I had spent so long trying to ignore, but it was also freeing. I heard stories from people who were struggling with their own demons, anxiety, depression, anger, grief, and it made me realize how connected we all were, how similar our struggles could be, even if the details were different. It wasn't just about sharing my own story, it was about listening, understanding, and offering support, and it made me feel less alone. One day, after a meeting, I was approached by a woman who had been quiet during most of the session. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to start, and then she said, "I just wanted to thank you. Hearing you talk about what you've been through, it made me feel like maybe there's hope for me too." I didn't know how to respond at first. I had never thought of myself as someone who could inspire hope in others. I was just trying to make sense of my own mess. But hearing her say those words, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, made me realize that maybe my journey, as difficult and messy as it was, could mean something to someone else. It was a humbling thought, but it was also a gift, one that I hadn't expected but was deeply grateful for. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had led me to this point. The darkness, the encounter with the figure, the slow, painful process of change. It hadn't been easy, and I knew it wasn't over. There would still be days when I struggled, when the old wounds would ache and the shadows would feel closer than I'd like. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet, steady assurance that I was on the right path. I understood now what the figure had meant when they said the light was inside me. It wasn't something I could find by looking outside myself, by comparing my life to others, by measuring my worth by what I thought I should have. It was something I had to nurture, to protect, and to share. And as long as I kept that light burning, no matter how small it might be, I knew I would find my way. In the end, it wasn't about erasing my past or pretending that I hadn't struggled. It was about learning from it, about seeing the shadows for what they were and choosing to move forward anyway. I wasn't perfect, and I never would be, but I was learning, growing, and that was enough. That was more than enough.